Here, and this afternoon we're going to talk about something that's really interesting, at least to me, because this is something I get lots of questions about, and this is something that the evolutionary community seems to sort of throw in our face all the time. You don't have answers for this. You don't have answers for this. What we're going to talk about the human eye. And the question is, with evolution, the eyes don't really have it. We're going to start here, Proverbs 20:12. The hearing ear, the seeing eye, the Lord hath made even both of them. When I think of the human eye, when I think of the human body, what I think about is how magnificent, how wonderful, how awesome is the Creator God. And, people come to me a lot and say, well, if you're a doctor, if you're a physician, if you went to medical school, how could you not understand, that the body's created, that it's marvelous, it's wonderful? Why are most doctors evolutionists? The answer, most doctors are so busy they don't think about it. It's not something that comes up from day. They're trying to keep grandma alive, okay? It's not, they don't wonder where grandma's kidney came from. They're just trying to keep it working. You don't think about where these things came from. But when you stop, when you step back and you just look at the marvelous complexity of the human body, you're just overwhelmed. What you understand is that this book is true. The Creator God of the universe did put into place these marvelous designs, and you just have to step back in awe and say, wow, what a great God we serve. But the world doesn't look at it that way. The world says all these structures came to be just because chemicals bumping together. And there's another verse you're going to hear from me a lot during this presentation, and it's this, Psalm 14:1. The fool hath said in his heart, there is no God.
In the beginning, life was blind. This is what our world looked like 4 billion years ago, before there were any eyes to see, until a few 100 million years passed. And then, one day, there was a microscopic copying error in the DNA of a bacterium. This random mutation gave that microbe a protein molecule that absorbed sunlight. Want to know what the world looked like to a light-sensitive bacterium? Take a look at the right side of the screen. Mutations continued to occur at random, as they always do in any population of living things. Another mutation caused a dark bacterium to flee intense light. What is going on here? Night and day. Those bacteria that could tell light from dark had a decisive advantage over the ones that couldn't. Why? Because the daytime brought harsh ultraviolet light that damages DNA. The sensitive bacteria fled the intense light to safely exchange their DNA in the dark. They survived in greater numbers than the bacteria that stayed at the surface. Over time, those light-sensitive proteins became concentrated in a pigment spot on the more advanced one-celled organism. This made it possible to find the light.
4 billion years ago, it was dark. Then there was a mutation, and light-sensitive pigments began to accumulate. And because these light-sensitive pigments, certain bacteria, certain organisms said, oh, the light's over there. The light's dangerous. The light can damage my DNA. So what these creatures did, they went where it was dark so they could exchange their DNA. Those who stayed near the light died. Those who went where it was dark survived. But as this light processing ability became more sophisticated, as it got better and better, it enabled these creatures to do what? To go back towards the light that was dangerous. If you're not confused yet, you will be by the time we're done. So light-sensitive pigments cause you to go away from the dangerous light, but when it got more complex, you go back towards the light. I don't get it either. During this week's episode, Tyson discussed the evolution of the eye, something creationists have said for years that evolution cannot explain, and attempting to use as evidence that life must be intelligently designed. Tyson eloquently explained how the eye evolved and how well scientists understand this evolution. Tyson touched on how many species have evolved an eye, but did leave out the fact that there are over 40 known independent eye evolutions, something that very clearly discredits any intelligent design. Think of that. Look at all these different varieties of eyes. In some evolutionary camps, they say that the eye has evolved over 40 different times. Wow, 40 different times. So there can't be a creator God. I'm not sure I buy that logic. But a lot of people come to me and say, well, Dr. Mitchell, I've heard that Darwin looked at the eye and said it really kind of discredited evolution. Darwin thought the eye was a problem with evolution. Actually, it wasn't when you read what Darwin actually said. To suppose that the eye, with all its inimitable contrivances for adjusting the focus to different distances, for admitting different amounts of light, for the correction of spherical and chromatic aberration, could have been formed by natural selection seems, I freely confess, absurd in the highest degree. And I would agree, it really is absurd. But that's not where he stopped. As we read further, if further the eye ever varies and variations be inherited, as is likewise certainly the case, and if such variation should be useful to any animal under changing conditions of life, then the difficulty of believing that a perfect and complex eye could be formed by natural selection, though insuperable by our imagination, should not be considered as subversive to the theory. Well, these traits, the eye changes, these traits are passed down to other generations, and obviously we see that, so obviously it can't, be subversive. It can't be a problem with my idea because, in his mind, he had this thought, there is no creator God. We have to be able to explain the things we see. And in a letter to a Harvard professor named Asa Gray, he wrote this, "Now I will just run through some points in your letter. What you say about my book gratifies me most deeply, and I wish I could feel all was deserved by me. I quite think a review from a man who is not an entire convert, if fair and moderately favorable, is in all respects the best kind of review. About the weak points, I agree. The eye to this day gives me a cold shudder. Well, when I think of the fine known gradation, my reason tells me I ought to conquer the cold shudder. What caused him to overcome it? My reason. We must have an explanation. We see these fine gradations, so one kind of eye must lead to another kind of eye to another kind of eye. My reason supersedes my concern. My response, the fool has said in their heart, there is no God." Since the time of Darwin, many evolutionary biologists have wrestled with the question of eye evolution. From an anatomical point of view, researchers have discovered many types of eyes. For example, their eyes of fruit flies, squid, and humans are quite different from each other. And they are. There's a marvelous diversity in the types of eyes, just like there's a marvelous diversity in the types of creatures we see in our world. This observation led evolutionary biologists to propose that eyes may have independently arisen multiple times during evolution. Based solely on morphology, such a hypothesis seemed reasonable and for many years was accepted by the scientific community. So therefore, we see all these different varieties of eyes, and it's hard to imagine maybe how this kind of eye would have ultimately evolved into this kind of eye. So maybe this one's evolved separately, and this type of eye evolved differently, and this kind of eye over here, we don't really know how to explain that, so it evolved differently. You've got all these different eye evolutions. In their seminal paper in 1977, Savi-Palwin and Maher compared overall structure, photoreceptor types, developmental origins of eye tissue, position of receptor axons, and other anatomical markers among eyes. Based on this analysis, they concluded that the eye evolved not once, but at least 40 different times, and possibly more. And this was felt to be a seminal paper in the evolutionary literature. They've shown that the eye evolved more than 40 different times. And if you step back and look at the different varieties of eyes, there is an amazing variety of eyes. And some are relatively simple, like the pinhole eye, which you'd find in a nautilus or a planaria flatworm. There's concave mirror type eyes, which you find in clams and scallops. And there are camera type eyes, going from relatively simple to relatively more complex. You find those in vertebrates, squid, octopus, and some spiders. And then you find the compound eyes. The eyes like you see in lots of insects that have the many, many segments. And they're talked about as simple, but if you look at these eyes, they're anything but simple. And there's enormous variety just within what we call compound eyes. There's the apposition compound eye, which you find in ants, wasps, dragonflies, bees, and cockroaches. There's the apposition neural superposition compound. Say that fast 3 times. They're found in some small flies. There's the refraction superposition compound eye, which you find in moths and flies and beetles and some shrimp. And it goes on and on. Just here's an example. These are eyes from the trilobite. The trilobite's a relatively simple creature. Actually, it's very complex in its own way, but certainly compared to humans, the trilobite is a simple creature. Look at the eyes in the trilobite. Are you going to tell me those structures are simple? Those are very complex structures. But the evolutionist generally has an explanation, like this one. Over time, simple eyes evolved into more complex types of eyes by modifications that resulted in addition of more cell types, such as lens cells and nerve cells. Future research will be needed to resolve this controversy. So we see relatively simple eyes and we see more complex eyes. So over time, lens cells and nerve cells just kind of came on the scene. It's a very you know, I don't know. There are words. But that's a very shaky basis to explain evolution. Well, these things got more complex because different types of tissues came on the scene.
Intelligent design proponents say the eye is too complex. It could not have evolved. Science says, look at the evidence.
Scientists like me see complex structures like the eye having arisen from natural processes through small individual steps rather than from a single large step.
Mollusks show an interesting series of developments that probably also represent stages in the evolution of the vertebrate eye. First, you get a light-sensitive row of cells. And that has an advantage because that at least lets you tell light from dark, and that's important for some biochemical processes. Next, you have another mollusk that has basically a cupped structure where the cells are inside of a basin, and that allows you to tell which direction the light is coming from. That's an advantage over just being able to tell light from dark, so that could be selected for. Next along the line, you have basically the equivalent of a pinhole camera, where primitive focusing becomes possible. Next comes the evolution of a primitive lens, which again is another improvement in the ability to focus an image. And finally, you have a very complex structure with a very good lens, which is able to focus light very effectively on the back of the eye and thus transmit a lot more information to the brain.
Well, there's your proof. First, you start with some light-sensitive cells. Remember that phrase, we're going to hear it again. You start with some light-sensitive cells. Then over time, this flat thing becomes sort of cupped. Then it becomes more cupped. Then it gets some little lips over the top, so you have sort of a pinhole camera. Then in the midst of all this change, you get this lens that shows up, and the lens gets more complex, and eventually the eye manages to make the lens sort of focus, and it all gets better. So therefore, there's your proof. There is no God that created. Evolution's true. You just saw multiple steps, multiple varieties of eyes. You know what all those eyes do? They work. They work in the creature that possesses those kind of eyes. They work well for that creature in that environment for the needs of that creature. Those are all fully formed eyes. Some are relatively simple, some are more complex. Certainly compared to human eyes, they're simple. But for that creature, it provides the visual input that it needs or the light sensing input it needs. Those are all fully functional formed structures. Now, to go from this collection of light-sensitive cells, and yes, you will hear that phrase again, you get these light-sensitive cells and it starts to cup, and we know that happened, but you know what has to go along with that? As eyes become more complex, as eyes become cupped, as lenses show up and focusing is more efficient, things like that, you have to have a higher processing neurologic system in order to process all this information. So, you couldn't put a human eye in an amoeba. It just wouldn't work. So the things you have to have a way to process all that information. So other than just this flat, light-sensitive plate becoming cupped and the lens showing up later, which is another really interesting concept, you have to have a way to process all the information. And as I found this clip on YouTube, I actually found a really cool comment. I don't generally read the comments, but this one I couldn't help. Even if I wasn't a Christian, I couldn't believe such a contrived load of rubbish that this lady's discussing. First, you get some light-sensitive cells. They call this science? Actually, that's exactly what they call it. They call it science. They line up a bunch of things, a bunch of structures from simple to complex, and they say, oh, there's a common ancestor. When I see all those structures, you know what I say? Wow, what an amazing creator God we serve. Because they're talking about fully functioning structures. And if all that wasn't enough, you've got diagrams like this all over the internet. You go from simple to more complex to more complex to more complex. Here you have 5 structures. And at the top, you see the name of the creature that these structures actually exist in. These things are functioning. They're not evolving, they're working. Wow, how could that be? They look like they go from simple to more complex. Well, I could put them in a different order if that makes you feel better. They're all fully functioning. But scientists actually have determined more than that.
Scientists not only see evidence of evolution in the increasing complexity of mollusk eye development, They see it even in our own development. The eyes of a human fetus grow increasingly complex, in stages, just as the eyes of mollusks have over thousands of years.
First of all, you get basically a light-sensitive patch, and then you get a cup-like form that eventually forms a whole lens and a full eye with all the nerves and all the connections, bringing light to the brain and so forth. And then the baby is born, and then you can see. If it can grow, it can evolve. A very similar process produces an eye in an organism that's born, like you or me, is a process that took place over millions of years across scores of different lineages of evolving organisms.
What this shows is a complex structure like the eye can develop through many small steps from something simpler. And this is how Darwinian evolution works.
No, it doesn't. It just shows we can take these structures, we can line them up from relatively simple to relatively complex and say, gosh, isn't evolution true? No, you've got a working eye, working eye, working eye, working eye, and a working eye. But guess what? You know, as the embryo develops, and this is just the amazing part of this video to me was, you know, it starts off with a small light-sensitive patch and it gets bigger and bigger, and then we're born and the baby can see. Well, a human eye and the eye of a mollusk are totally different. The structures that the light-sensitive cells come from, totally different tissues. But they relate this. I mean, is she suggesting we're revisiting our evolutionary heritage in the womb? I mean, she didn't say that, but it sure was implied. Look, it starts off as a light-sensitive patch, and it's like the mollusk. Of course, it happens in 9 months here, but they know it happened over millions of years before, because guess what? They know that because they've lined up these diagrams from simple to complex. Now, how those things go from simple to complex, it's really funny. That never gets exactly explained. And here's another one the evolutionists have a lot of trouble with. This is the anableps. This is a fish with bifocals. You can laugh, but that's pretty much, this fish has 2 corneas and 2 retinas. When it's on the surface, it has sort of a convex structure to the retina, and it focuses, to the cornea, and it focuses on a different retina because the way the water, bends the light. When it's underwater, it looks through a different eye, essentially. So this creature didn't evolve. It's got 2 different structures. So how do you explain it? I know how to explain it. I don't even have to worry about it. I know who made it. And I think God made it just to kind of confuse people who think they know that it came from a different way. But anyway, eyes of some sort occur in most animal phyla, but their construction and ontogeny vary enormously. One distinction is between eyes with photoreceptor cells that differentiate from the central nervous system and those with photoreceptor cells that differentiate from the epidermis. The vertebrate eyes of the former kind and the cephalopod and arthropod eyes are of the latter. You see, the origin of the light-sensitive cells in different species, different kinds of creatures, comes from different basic tissue types. So this whole, we can understand this, or the baby sort of revisits the mollusk eye. That's really not true because the light receptor cells come from different tissues. The different optical types of eye, simple versus compound, also, of course, require fundamentally different developmental programs. Even eyes of the same type often show fundamental differences, such as the retina being inverse, where the photoreceptors face the back of the eye, and that happens in vertebrates, and everse, where the photoreceptors face the front of the eye, and you find that, say, in cephalopods. So what we've got are all these different varieties of eyes. We've got these different varieties of creatures. So if you look at the morphology, it looks like the eye evolved at least 40 different times. 40 different eye evolutions occurred. But that's not the end of the story. The situation took a dramatic turn when geneticists began to study eye development. Researchers identified a master control gene called PAX6. The protein encoded by the PAX6 gene is a transcription factor that controls the expression of many other genes, including those involved in the development of the eye in both rodents and humans. Now, this to me is really incredible. This is good science. I like this. We found this master control gene, and it controls the development of eyes, which I think is just really cool because you find this or similar genes in lots of different types of creatures. So I'm going, wow, the geneticists, they've uncovered this master switch. But that's not exactly the way they interpreted it. Note that when the mouse PAX6 master control gene switches on eye formation in Drosophila, which is the fruit fly, the eye produces a Drosophila eye, not a mouse eye. Why does this occur? It happens because the PAX6 master control gene activates genes from the Drosophila genome. So you've got this really cool genetic switch. And what they did, they took the PAX6 gene from a mouse, they put it in the Drosophila, and they stimulated it. So what happened? An eye occurred. What kind of eye? A fly eye. Why? Because it's a fly. I'm not going too fast for you, am I? I didn't make a diagram for this, but I hope maybe you could grab that. Okay, so the switch was turned on, the fly made a fly eye. The reason the PAX6 gene does not code for eyes, it controls for on and off. It's a really cool switch. And I think this is amazing, but at the end of the day, the creatures still have the genetic material that code for the eyes of their particular type. So what they found is a control switch. Since the discovery of the PAX6 and another gene that's called an eyeless gene, homologs of this gene have been discovered in many different species. In all cases where it's been tested, the gene is involved with eye development. Gehrig and colleagues have hypothesized that the eyes of many different species have evolved from a common ancestor, consisting of, as proposed by Darwin, one photoreceptor cell and one pigment cell. So now they're starting to question this idea that the eye evolved 40 different times. We've got this control system that occurs in many different creatures, so maybe all eyes went back to one common ancestor. Now you'll notice also that that's one photoreceptor cell and one pigment cell. Remember, we're going to start off with some photocells that we talked about earlier. It always comes back to that. You know, we're going to start, once we have the photoreceptor cells, we can maybe explain it. But now they're saying maybe all eyes came from one common ancestor. Not because they shared the genetic information, but because they have a common switch. Now, when I look at the PAX6 gene, you know what I think? How amazing is the God we serve? Because guess what? He's got this really cool genetic mechanism to turn things on and off. So what's he going to do? He's going to use it in lots of types of creatures that he creates. Wow, that's not a stretch. We've got a similar control system. But when you turn this gene on in mice, you get what kind of eyes? You get mice eyes. You turn it on in flies, you get what? Flies. It's a switch. Here's a switch. I can go to my office upstairs, flip the switch, a fluorescent light comes on. I go to my little loft at home where my wife tells me to stay most of the time. I flip that switch, an incandescent bulb comes on. I go to my garage and flip the switch. Nothing happens because the bulb's out. I get 3 different results, same switch. Turn on light, turn off light. It's got nothing to do with the genetic information coding for eyes. It's got everything to do with turning things on and off. Recently, the multiple origins hypothesis based on the morphologic evidence has been challenged by results from molecular experiments. Specifically, Gehrig and Iko proposed that because a single well-conserved master gene, the PAX6, can initiate eye construction in diverse species, eyes must have arisen from a single ancestor. To me, that's a stretch. To me, I look at that and go, wow, what an amazing designer. He used the same switch type in many different creatures. This in no way helps you understand where the genetic makeup of all these different eyes come from. It's just the way you turn it on and off. But not everybody really agrees. In a paper written by a gentleman named Fernald, he points out, first, there's a strong suggestion that the PAX6 gene is what they call autoregulatory, as are many transcription factors. Second, several additional genes have been shown to induce ectopic eyes in Drosophila. So see, the PAX6 is not the only gene that does this necessarily. Third, there are many animals with no eyes that nevertheless express PAX6 or its homologs. So sometimes it's on in creatures that have no eyes. Fourth, PAX6 does not just organize eye development, but appears at numerous other expression sites. So his conclusion was this. Taken together, these data suggest that neither PAX6 or any other gene exerts the master control of eye development across phylogeny. Genetic control of eye construction is staggeringly complex, and it seems more likely that an interactive gene network regulates development of all complex organs, including the eye.
At the University of Lund in Sweden, zoologist Dan Erik Nilsson has developed models to show how a primitive eye spot could evolve through intermediate stages to become a complex human-like eye in less than 500,000 years.
Yeah, I've been interested in eye evolution for a long time. I mean, in particular, I've been interested in the question of how long time it would take for an eye to evolve.
Nilsson envisioned a sequence of stages by by which a flat patch of light-sensitive cells on an animal's skin could evolve into a camera-type eye. As a first step, nature would favor any changes that made the flat patch more cup-like.
Okay, so what he's interested in is how long would it take to go from a flat patch of light-sensitive cells to basically the point where you have a rudimentary camera-type eye. He's not talking about going from a flat patch of cells to a human eye necessarily, but to a basic camera-type eye. And here's the paper. It's called A Pessimistic Estimate of the Time Required for an Eye to Evolve. I think pessimistic would be optimistic when you look at some of the stuff that's in the paper. But nonetheless, you go from a flat set of light-sensitive things to a compound eye. And I'm just going to read you some of the things in the paper to really encourage you about this. Taking a patch of pigmented light-sensitive epithelium as the starting point, we avoid the more inaccessible problem of photoreceptor cell evolution. In other words, guess what we're doing? We're starting with a patch of photoreceptive cells. See, that's where it always starts. We don't know where they came from, so we're going to start with these cells. Then, we have made such calculations by outlining a plausible sequence of alterations leading from a light-sensitive spot all the way to a fully developed lens eye. So we're starting off with a patch of light-sensitive cells, and we've sort of outlined for ourselves a plausible sequence of alterations that would lead us from here to the basic camera eye. And this was further on in the paper. We let the evolutionary sequence start with a patch of light-sensitive cells. It always goes back to that. We're going to start with the light-sensitive cells. Then we assume that the patch is circular and that selection does not alter the total width of the structure. The latter assumption is necessary to isolate the design changes from the general alterations of the size of the organ. We assume the patch is circular. Okay. Then, the development of a lens with a mathematically ideal distribution of refractive index may at first glance seem miraculous. You know, he's really close to right. That may be the best sentence in that whole long, very boring paper. He goes further to say this: the nervous system in the vertebrate retina can also be ignored, as this is clearly part of the nervous system which just happens to reside in the eye. So we're going to ignore all this nervous tissue, the nervous system, which obviously has to be much more complex because a flat, light-sensitive spot doesn't transmit as much information as a compound eye. The compound eye is going to require a more complex nervous system, but we're just going to ignore that in our calculations. So this is his little diagram going from flat to the camera-type eye, and this is what he says. If we assume a generation time of 1 year, which is common for small and medium-sized aquatic animals, it would take less than 364,000 years for a camera eye to evolve from a light-sensitive patch. If we assume all these things, it takes less than 364,000 years for a camera eye to evolve from a light-sensitive patch. I'm going to let somebody else make my comment for me.
The problem with those who are unable to see evolution, I think, is they don't have imaginations.
I may not have any imagination, but evolution's got more than enough for both of us. We're going to start with a light-sensitive patch of cells. This is going to become a cup, and they know it can happen in 364,000 years. My comment is simply this, one more time: the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. Most modern phyla can be traced back to the Cambrian explosion, 530 to 520 million years ago. The fauna that appeared during the Cambrian explosion included a wealth of bilaterally symmetric and mobile animals with what? Well-developed eyes.
At every stage of its development, the evolving eye functioned well enough to provide a selective advantage for survival. And among animals alive today, we find eyes at all these stages of development. And all of them function.
It just takes your breath away, doesn't it? At every stage of development, what we see in our world today are all these different creatures with all different eyes, and what does he call it? Different stages of development. You know what we see? We see all these creatures with all these varieties of eyes. You know what these eyes do? They're working. They're not developing. They're fully functional. But he looks at all these eyes and says, no, this is obviously evolution. These things are developing. They're progressing. No, what they're not. They're working. But we might as well go ahead and to the big one, to the big issue. What about the human eye?
Valerie Young's retinal tear is just one example of imperfections in the design of human eyes. Another occurs because nerve cells and blood vessels evolved to lie in front of the retina, where they interfere with its ability to form sharp images. It's like trying to take a picture through a foggy piece of glass. And the optic nerve itself evolved to connect to the brain through a hole in the retina. So the eyes of all vertebrates have a small blind spot, right near the middle of the visual field.
Evolution starts with what's already there, tinkers with it and modifies it, but can never do a grand redesign. So even the eye, with all of its optical perfection, has clues to the fact that its origin is of the blind process of natural selection.
Wow. Okay, first of all, the eye is terrible. It's like looking through a piece of foggy glass. I mean, I know I've got glasses, but I see most of you folks pretty clearly. When I was younger, I saw everything without the glasses. So it's not really like looking through a piece of foggy glass. It's amazing for all the complaints the evolutionists make about how the human eye is really not that good, that we all see really well. But it's the same old thing. There's the blind spot. There's the blood vessels on the surface of the retina. It's like looking through a piece of foggy glass. We really don't see that well. And then he says, well, evolution can't redesign things. And in their view, to be fair, they can't. It can't because you've got a certain structure. It doesn't go back to ground zero and start again. It has to work with what you've got. But if you've got eyes that have evolved 40 different times or more, you think maybe evolution would have gotten it right at least once, right? Though the human eye would be a scandal if it were the result of divine deliberation, a plausible evolutionary explanation of its absurd construction can be obtained quite easily. I didn't know our eyes were absurdly constructed. I thought they were marvelously designed. But according to these people, our eyes just don't function. It's a wonder we don't bump into walls and things if our eyes are so terrible.
The complexity of the human eye poses no challenge to evolution by natural selection. In fact, the eye and all of biology makes no sense without evolution.
If there's one thing I've heard a lot in the last few years, it's that. I've actually had college professors tell me that my medical license should be taken away because I don't accept evolution. So obviously for all those years I was actively practicing medicine, I was just a total incompetent because I don't accept evolution as the foundation for my thinking, although I think I was a pretty good doctor to all those patients. So please don't go back and tell all those people I took care of over all those years that I was really incompetent because they made a mistake by staying alive. I mean, how dare they? But, evolution is the foundation of biology, and if we don't understand evolution, we really can't understand. The only way you can really understand the eye is through the lens of evolution. Is the human eye proof of evolution? Is the human retina evidence of bad design? And really the question comes down to this. Did God put the film in backwards? Because I've actually had people tell me, well, God put the retina in backwards. God put the film in backwards. The retina has been put together backwards. Unlike the retinas of octopuses and squids, in which the light-gathering cells are aimed forward toward the source of incoming light, the photoreceptor cells of the human retina are aimed backwards, away from the light source. Boy, the evolutionists just don't like that. Worse yet, the nerve fibers, which must carry signals from the retina to the brain, must pass in front of the receptor cells, partially impeding the penetration of light to the receptors. Only a blasphemer would attribute such a situation to divine design. And it makes me nervous to read that last sentence because I have a personal relationship with that designer. And the last thing I'm ever going to do is blaspheme his name. What a wonderful creator we serve. But the world says, no, this is a lousy design. It can't be a very good God to design things like this. You know why? The world says, we wouldn't have done it this way. Well, there's certainly a charge against God. Any engineer would naturally assume that the photocells would point towards the light, with their wires leading backward towards the brain. He would laugh at any suggestion that the photocells might point away from the light, with their wires departing on the side nearest the light. Yet this is exactly what happens in all vertebrate retinas. Each photocell is, in effect, wired in backwards, with the wire sticking out on the side nearest the light. The wire has to travel over the surface of the retina to a point where it dives through a hole in the retina, the so-called blind spot, to join the optic nerve. This means that the light, instead of being granted an unrestricted passage through the photocells, has to pass through a forest of connecting wires, presumably suffering at least some attenuation and distortion. Actually, probably not much, but still, it's the principle of the thing that would offend any tiny-minded engineer. I mean, it does all this, and actually, at the end of the day, it really doesn't affect anything, but, you know, human engineers, we just really wouldn't like that, and we're tidy-minded, and we just don't think God should have done it that way. And at the end, Richard Dawkins concludes with this: I don't know the exact explanation for this strange state of affairs. My comment to Richard Dawkins: a fool has said in his heart, there is no God. Well, let's get to that poorly designed eye. What a total engineering mess this is. I'm almost so ashamed of this horrible piece of God's handiwork that I'm almost ashamed to describe it to you, but it works perfectly. You have the cornea in the front, then you have the lens behind it. In front of the lens, you have the iris, which allows the light to be, you know, less light, more light as it constricts or widens. And in the back, you have the retina, which is where we're going to concentrate. Now, you heard earlier that the blind spot, if you will, is near the center of the visual field. Actually, it's not as close to the center of the visual field as the evolutionists generally claim when they're making these charges against creationists and against God in particular, because the light comes this direction. This is the light axis. You know where it hits? It hits what's called the fovea centralis, the highest acuity part of the retina. The sharpest part of the retina is right there. Guess where the light's directed? The blind spot is here. It's actually off axis. Now, the way it works is the optic nerve is not directly behind the eye, because this is a view like from the top down. So the way it works is the optic nerve is not like this. The optic is sort of inward like that. You know, it kind of pushes in towards the nose. So what happens if you look in the front of the eye, this is what you'll see. You see, and this is the right eye. What you see here is the point of sharpest focus. It's here. And the blind spot is here. It's actually, you know, off the direct visual axis. And it's true, we do have a small blind spot, you know, in each eye. The thing is, we have how many eyes? 2. Do you look around and see any like dark spot where something you can't see? No, I have a complete visual field from side to side. I don't notice a blind spot at all. You know why? I have 2 eyes. The blind spots are offset. They compensate for each other because the way the signals are processed in the brain more than compensates for this. This is not a problem for humans at all. But the world says, wait a minute, this is wired in backwards. Actually, I'm 57 years old. I don't recall bumping into a wall yet. Everything works. My eyes work fine. Now, having said that, what about somebody who loses an eye through disease or an accident or something, and you lose an eye? Well, then you don't have something to compensate for that blind spot as well, right? But at the end of the day, if you lose one eye, the blind spot's really not your issue. The fact is you've lost stereoscopic vision. That's a far greater problem for you. This is really not a problem except in the mind of the evolutionist. This is the retina. This is one of the most amazing things in the human body. I look at this and just go, wow, this is you're in awe of the Creator. This is not only designed, it's exquisitely designed. Now, this is from the inside out. The top is inside the eye. As we go further out, it's the optic nerve fibers, the optic ganglia. You have some bipolar neurons here. Then you get to the photoreceptor cells, you know, the rods and cones that everybody's heard about. Then you have, this is called the pigment epithelium, or the retinal pigment epithelium. Then you have what's called the choroid, where there are lots and lots of blood vessels. And then you have the outer coating, which is the sclera. Now, guess which way the light's coming? The light's coming this way, which just upsets the world to no end. This is bad design. This doesn't work. This is just wrong. No engineer would have done it this way. Actually, God did it this way because God knew exactly what he was doing. The pigment epithelium has complex mechanisms for dealing with toxic molecules and free radicals that are produced by the action of light. Specific enzymes such as the superoxide dismutases, the catalases, and peroxidases are present to catalyze the breakdown of potentially harmful molecules such as superoxide and hydrogen peroxide. Antioxidants such as alpha-tocopherol, which is vitamin E, and ascorbic acid, which is vitamin C, are available to reduce oxidative damage. Now, the thing is, when light comes in and hits these photoreceptor cells, you've got a lot of activity going on. You're turning light energy, you have chemical reactions, you have the production of electrical impulses that take this information to the brain. There's a lot of metabolic activity going on. There are a lot of chemical byproducts being generated as the light hits these cells and these chemical reactions go on. There's a lot of chemicals, generated. Guess what else there's generated? There's a lot of heat generated. And guess what's right there to take care of that? All the blood flow in the choroid. You have all this activity, all the blood flow there that brings nutrients, that takes away all the chemicals that are generated. It helps regenerate the cones and the rods of photoreceptor cells. They're right there basically next to their lifeline, which is the blood supply. In 1980, a paper was published which explained for the first time something already known about the choroid. That is, its very high rate of blood flow, which far exceeds the nutritional needs of the retina, despite the latter being highly active metabolically. The choroid is remarkable for having the highest blood flow per gram of tissue of all tissues in the body, even higher than the kidney. You know why? We need to get those bad chemicals out, get the new chemicals there, provide the nutrition, provide the oxygen, get rid of the heat. Because without this working, what would happen is the next time somebody flashed a light bulb in your face, it would take a long time for these things to regenerate. Not in the human eye. We're good to go. This is the fovea. This is the point of highest visual acuity. And you'll notice there are no surface blood vessels. They're pretty much mostly cones in this area. But you know where the light axis is directed? Right there. This is another view of the retina. This is obviously it's an older illustration, but the thing is, you look at this and you go, look at all those structures that the light has to go through, but then when you realize it, when you really pay attention, there's something here we need to really look at closely, and it's this cell right here. This is called a Mueller cell, and they are incredible, incredible things. Just amazing to see the Mueller cell. Now you'll see the top; it almost looks like it's like a funnel, and it goes down to the bottom. You know what the Mueller cells do? They're actually like fiber optic cells. What they do is they take the light that hits the retina and take that light directly to the photoreceptor cells. Fiber optic cables are very highly efficient. So are the Mueller cells. They actually substantially increase the efficiency of the retina. If you look at the surface of the retina, because the way the Mueller cells are created, they're like funnel-like at the top, they cover a substantial portion of the surface of the retina. So they actually direct the light to where it needs to go. And that's cool enough, but it's actually much better than that. The Mueller cells also help cut down the light noise inside the eye. You know, because light sort of refracts around to different places. What it does, it actually helps filter out some of the noise or some of the fuzziness, if you will. They actually help make the image sharper on the retina. And you can either make yourself believe that those cells got there by accident, or that the Creator God of the universe in His wisdom said, I know exactly how to make this thing the most efficient it can be. I'm going to put these cells there. I'm going to direct the light through all this tissue directly to where it needs to go. And while it's traveling, I'm just going to clean up the image. Wow. How amazing is the God we serve? But the world says that's not true. The world says this: even if all the data point to an intelligent designer, such a hypothesis is excluded from science because it's not naturalistic. A fool has said in his heart, there is no God. And as cool as all that is, I mean, like I said, the retina is not only well designed, it's exquisitely designed. And I'm going to read you a quote that's almost 30 years old. To simulate 10 milliseconds of the complete processing of even a single nerve cell from the retina would require the solution of about 500 simultaneous nonlinear differential equations 100 times, and would take at least several minutes of processing time on a Cray supercomputer. Keeping in mind there are 10 million or more such cells interacting with each other in complex ways, it would take a minimum of 100 years of Cray time to simulate what takes place in your eye many times a second. Now, in that period of time, obviously computers have come a long way. You know, we've gotten our way past Windows Vista, which just proves we live in a fallen, cursed world. And I now use a Mac, which has made my life much better, and I'm now in the light instead of the darkness. But nonetheless, computers have come a long way. But having said that, just look at the amount of processing that goes on in 1 second in the eye. In 1 second, that much signal processing happens. How complex is the retina? There you go. It would take supercomputers to do the same amount of processing our eye does, essentially instantaneously. But the world says, well, you know, we can't see like I do. We don't see in the dark like some creatures. Our eyes can't do this. Our eyes can't do that. But you know what our eyes do for us? Exactly what we need them to do. The human visual system cannot register motion as accurately or as sensitively as that of a fly. But if it did, we would see all fluorescent lighting and television flickering continually. We cannot see at night as well as a cat, but we surpass it in some other areas. For example, cats have no color vision. The human eye represents an excellent balance between versatility and performance, which has enabled man's astonishing technological achievements in antiquity. But still, the evolutionists persist. This is what they say. The multiple aspects of eye evolution, gene sharing, convergence, homology, and parallelism, all occurring simultaneously reflect the enormous richness of choices that nature provides at each instant over hundreds of millions of years under changing conditions. The ambiguities in evolutionary history that we spectators at a distance are left with resemble the literature qualities of science, where the great conflicts are seldom resolved to finality. The richness of choiceness that nature provides over hundreds of millions of years. And he goes further to say this: we are writing narratives about characters we never met, that were born and in some cases died during the events before our time, and that may have had similar or quite different functions during their lifetime than their progeny have today. We are writing narratives about characters we have never met. You know what he's really saying? We're making up stories about things we've never seen. We're coming to conclusions over observations we've never made and cannot make because they're in the past. Essentially, we're writing stories about the past. Our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is the key to an understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just-so stories, because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. It's not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, that we're forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door.
Some claim that evolution is just a theory, as if it were merely an opinion. The theory of evolution, like the theory of gravity, is a scientific fact. Evolution really happened. Accepting our kinship with all life on Earth is not only solid science. In my view, it's also a soaring spiritual experience.
I've got a response. A fool that said that there is no God. Psalm 94:9. He that planted the ear, shall he not hear? He that formed the eye, shall he not see? Romans 1:20. For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead. So they're without excuse. Those who suppress the truth and unrighteousness, they are truly without excuse. Just see the enormous, the marvelous complexity of just the eye. I'm not talking about all the other things, but just look at the eye and you go, this is a product of random chance processes? Or that our understanding of engineering would lead us to believe this should have been done a different way? Look at how marvelously this structure works. You look at this and the only conclusion you can have is, how great is the God we serve? And in conclusion, I'll leave you with this, Matthew 13:16. But blessed are your eyes, for they see. And for those who know the Lord and recognize and acknowledge him as Creator and worship and trust him as Savior, may that truly be said of all of us. And with that, we'll conclude. Thank you. I do want to take just a minute.